Hello, hello, it's Merite again, and welcome to another episode of Sound Scribe. Today I'm joined by Dave Evans from Falling Squirrel, who made the audio game The Vale, which is available on Xbox and PC, and it's going to be released in early 2021. So without further ado, let's go talk to Dave. Hi, Dave, and welcome. Very happy to have you here with us today. First and foremost, for the people out there that are not familiar with you or your work, why don't you just go ahead and introduce yourself briefly and what your background is and what kind of stuff you do?
Sure. I'm a game developer. I'm the owner and studio director of a company called Falling Squirrel Games, and we're currently making a audio-based game for the visually impaired. At least that's sort of our target audience, but we're hoping it might have some broad appeal for its novelty elsewhere. And I have a background in film and television, and I moved to games about 10 years ago now, and I'm really focused on telling interesting narratives, and I thought this was an interesting sort of place to go to find interesting stories in having a blind protagonist and a story that might be relatable outside of maybe the common places to go in terms of like medieval
Yeah,
fantasy storytelling, that sort of thing.
yeah, absolutely. Had you worked on any sort of projects that were sort of audio based before this, or was this kind of a first for you?
It was half of it was a real first. The actual development of an audio game, there was a lot of learning from scratch in terms of the audience for games like this, people who are comfortable or knew these games well. I had to sort of verse myself in what is a sort of a genre in and of itself. But the recording of the audio and the working with actors, which is sort of the focus in terms of the quality bar I wanted to hit, that came out of my days working in video games as a cinema director and voiceover director and writer. So that part I was comfortable with. Everything else was pretty new.
So during the production, you had the chance to work alongside, what was it, the CNIB? Tell me a bit about how that worked and what happened there.
Yeah, the CNIB is the Canadian National Institute for the Blind.
Hmm.
And the game idea initially was something I just thought would be novel from a very personal point of view. I thought it was an interesting idea to have a blind protagonist, which, by the way, in the blind community of development, it's a trope, which I learned very quickly that a lot of sighted developers have a blind protagonist when they're making an all audio game. I came about it the other way. I wasn't thinking of making an audio game initially. I just thought it was an interesting character to explore.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I wanted to provide an experience almost for more thinking from my perspective as a sighted audience, and allowing the visual impairment or the lack of sight to be an empowering aspect of combat and all sorts of things and exploration and adventure. I just thought it'd be an interesting character to play. And then within a few months of developing this, I realized, well, wait a minute, if there's no visuals, obviously this could be an accessible game. So I reached out to the CNIB without knowing fully what kind of reception the idea would have and how many people were interested in games in general. And then I realized there was a quite a large dedicated community for audio games within the blind community. And they helped me set up my first playtesting session. So my very first testers weren't from the sighted community. They were from largely the blind community coming in and giving me a lot of great feedback and helping me learn about not only the community and what the game could mean to them, but also just making it a better game for everybody. Some very insightful things come from people who listen a lot.
Yeah.
So it was great.
Fantastic, fantastic. And so I imagine when you start creating an audio-based game and your main objective is to make something accessible for the blind and the visually impaired community. I imagine that sometimes comes a bit of a disconnect where some things might actually be much easier for the blind and the visually impaired community to pick up on than sighted players. Was that something you experienced, and what were some of the steps that you took to make sure that it was an experience that everyone could enjoy equally?
Yeah, a lot of the early things I had to do to make it accessible, because there's no visuals. There's a common starting
Right.
point for anybody playing it who is in either the sighted or the blind community.
Hmm.
And I realized that the sighted community would need more help, mainly for two obvious reasons, I think. One is the idea of uh, navigating a soundscape, I suppose, would come more naturally to somebody who relies on that more heavily day to day.
Yeah.
But the bigger factor was the uh, conventions, game conventions that sighted people took for granted. So if I was telling somebody how the controller worked and how controls worked, and because I would have to verbally tell them this, they wouldn't get visual feedback to know precisely what was happening, whether or not pushing the controller right or left was turning you on the spot versus strafing. That was something that the sighted community wouldn't they weren't listening to the instructions very carefully, to be quite honest.
Hmm.
Whereas within the audio community or the blind community, they didn't take as much for granted in terms of instruction. They were listening very carefully to what I was saying, and then there was no assumptions about how it should work,
Hmm.
at least less assumptions, which came from a familiarity or a lack of familiarity with a controller, essentially. So, and of course, the blind community itself would be a very diverse community as well in terms of people's familiarity,
Yeah.
but it still came down to the importance of listening. It was like I don't know, a kindergarten class or something where one group of people listened intensely and very carefully to instruction, and another group did not. So I had to put a lot more crutches in. In fact, the reason we even have particles in the game is
Hmm.
really, it's really a little not smoke and mirrors. It's a crutch essentially, so that
Oh, I
people
see.
who are expecting a certain control scheme immediately understand how the controls are working. Whether I'm turning on the spot or strafing is a lot more obvious when you have particles in the space.
Hmm.
But that's pretty much why they're there.
Hmm.
Is to help sighted gamers who make assumptions about how a game's going to work.
Interesting, interesting. Because I was about to ask you what the role of the particles was and why you exactly chose for that rather than having a completely sort of dark game. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, the
Um,
game is probably best played with your eyes closed, to be
yeah.
honest. So once you understand how movement works, you probably should close your eyes.
Hmm. Hmm. So elsewhere, I saw that you mentioned that a specific strength of the game was the amount of intimacy involved in the game. Could you tell me a little bit more about some specifics where you think that intimacy really sort of shone?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things we have as the advantage of doing an audio game is I know certain things. I know that you're going to be playing with a headset because first of all, it kind of requires it.
Hmm.
And when someone's making a big, broad visual game, um, we always talk about this in game development, where someone could be playing with the sound off, could be playing with subtitles on. There's all these things. Well, I know my audience is going to be playing with a headset, so I can now use certain things a headset will give you. For example, binaural audio. So if anybody's, I'm going to get the wrong acronym, but is it ASMR?
Hmm. Yeah, that's
Whatever
the
that
one.
response is, yeah. So there is a response people get from that kind of audio experience, and I won't go into whatever the biology of that is, but on top of that, uh, it it's established, especially if characters, whether they're friends or enemies, are close to you. That's something that becomes a lot more present with this audio, this binaural audio.
Hmm.
And I know that people are going to have that common experience because they're reliant on it to play the game. So that's one thing that allows us to do all sorts of things like playing with space that's not really part of most games. Most games, the space you're playing in is, at least in combat scenario, would be somebody's a few feet in front of you or they're far away. So you might be shooting them, some sort of projectile at them, or you're fighting them with a sword. Whereas here I have another level of space which moves into sort of an intimate space where I can have a character move from 3 feet in front of you to whispering in your ear. And that's the kind of thing that you wouldn't normally be doing in games. Obviously, VR experiences can do this. So in a way, we're picking up where VR often is starting. But that's the technology, I guess, is the one aspect of it. And the other thing is, because of the one thing that, again, in visual games, is there's a limit to how close you want to be to things because they start to break down technically. So even in the absolute best game team in the world, the best, I guess the highest, the most expensive games, like a Naughty Dog game or something,
Hmm.
where their face effects and their facial animation, the hair and the skin are very, very good. There's still limits to how close and how expensive it is to get close. And by removing visuals, I can bring characters very close to you without worrying about loss of immersion, where all of a sudden you're nitpicking about the way the skin looks or the hair looks. So with decent acting, a good voice performance, and a relatively clean soundscape and the binaural audio, I can create something it's much more real feeling than in a visual experience where you might be taken out of that experience by nitpicking about the way the hair flow didn't feel right. I believe that there's a real person there because I'm not taken out of that experience.
Hmm. Hmm. And I mean, I imagine as well that in an audio-based game, like there's a lot of information that we can get, but there might also be a limit to how much information you can give the player before they get overwhelmed. Was that something that you struggled with at all, or what did you have specific approaches to that?
Yeah, we're still, to be honest, we're still struggling with it in the audio
Hmm.
balance. In early towns and villages you can visit in the game, it's relatively easy to navigate. For one, it's with the idea of presenting the player with a tutorial for movement. I just created a scenario that made that work. I didn't make a artificial town to make it easier to play. I just put you in a small town that had a tavern and a blacksmith, and those are the only two places you can go. It's a relatively empty town, so relatively easy to navigate to. And then as the
Hmm.
game progresses, not only did I want more complexity in the choice you had within towns for finding quests and discovery within an explorable space, I also wanted a bigger experience, more people, and that gets tricky because to
Hmm.
create a believable crowded space, you end up now having atmospheric audio that competes with the beacons that you're supposed to be listening for. And we're still working on this, trying to make it as playable as possible. But I'm completely
Hmm.
relying on focus testing in this space because I know where everything is. So I
Yeah.
really need people to play it and to tell me where we're at with the bar. If I made it believable and you can still navigate, or is it just a cacophony of sounds
Yeah.
that's impossible? So yeah, for certain spaces, that's a big issue
Hmm.
for sure.
Hmm. Interesting, interesting. And I mean, this seems like an incredibly large large scope project. Were you working on it alone, or did you have a team working on it, or how did that work?
It's a very small team.
Okay.
I'm the only one who's really on it full time, but we did it over it's been 3 years now, probably over 3 years in terms of when I thought of even doing the project. But I've been working on other projects in between this, so it's not been 3 full years. But that gives you a lot of time to think about things and develop ideas. Um, and the other thing that made this thing possible is just finding the right people to help me. Because I'm not an audio engineer, so I needed to find a very good audio engineer. So I have a lot of people, even if their contribution hours wise isn't a lot, their experience is. I could not do this on my own,
Hmm.
for sure. And in particular, I'm not a programmer, so I've always been reliant on programmers. So I was lucky to have worked in AAA and made friends with very experienced programmers who can do things very quickly, very well, and they hold my hand essentially as I make this game.
Hmm.
And I'm providing mostly the direction and writing and that sort of thing, and get a ton of feedback from people and the blind community in particular.
Hmm.
Um, because I mean, by luck, I have found some very good developers within the community
Wow.
who not only are on their own would be great design minds, but on the same time they have a perspective that I don't have too.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's favors and friends, and that's what's put this together essentially.
That sounds fantastic. And is the playtesting still ongoing as well as we speak?
Yeah, it is. There's, I'm trying to think of exactly where we're at right now, but we've put out some demos which we got feedback on that have appeared on for limited time on Xbox and then on Steam and itch.io, and I still read all the comments that come in, getting sort of focus feedback. And I mean, because we're a small team and don't have a lot of bandwidth, a lot of machines to test on, I'm still relying on the community for bug testing because there might
Yeah.
be conflicts with hardware and stuff that we just don't have the size to handle. But we will. I have a community. There is a community on audiogames.net. I think that's the one,
Yep.
and they are. They've been crucial in me sending out sort of private builds. So I think I will be picking people from that community that have already helped me so much to play the entire game, sort of a beta testing group. And that's about to begin probably within the next few months because we're looking to
Fantastic.
release early next year.
Hmm.
And that's going to be essential. I'm going to have my best guess at what the game should be, and they're going to tell me if I'm close, I guess.
Fantastic, fantastic. So tell me a bit about the casting process and how you found the right voice actors for the specific roles in this game.
Yeah, we're fairly close to Toronto, and that's where I've always cast out of. We decided. I mean, there's enough excellent talent within both the non-union and union communities that it's an option. But we went with Unity or Unity. What's wrong with me? Union talent. And so we went through the normal channels for casting. We got a great response. The tricky thing for, I think this would be the case anywhere you're casting when you have certain limitations. I wanted some very specific accents, and I generally try to cast as close to type as possible. So
Hmm.
if I'm looking for a regional accent, ideally it would be a native speaker within that region,
Yeah.
or they can channel their father or something. Because I think most of the people I've cast are Canadian, but for the Arabic accents, they're people who have come from households that spoke Arabic and they can speak Arabic and things like that.
Hmm.
And then it was actually English accents, British accents were one of the tougher ones. I was a little bit
Yeah.
surprised. And so I did do a casting session out of London as well.
Oh wow.
So there's some Londoners in the game, providing a good third of the voices are coming from London. And I also wanted to include the visually impaired community, which again was tricky with the accent needs.
Yeah.
I had some excellent actors that I basically said, what accent can you do? And I would make sure there was characters that would work in the game. So maybe, I don't know if this is fitting or ironic, but I have four visually impaired actors playing sighted characters in the game, and I
Hmm.
think I have three blind characters played by sighted actors. So it didn't work out perfectly, but I'd like to think I did a decent job with representation, um, and because they're familiar with the script, and I also have another group of people that can kind of help me understand the community and the kinds of things that people within the community will think about when they're playing the game and
Hmm.
what'll matter to them narrative wise.
Yeah. Fantastic, fantastic. And do you have any plans to take the Veil further after the initial release in early 21? Any plans for a sequel or any of that?
Yeah, the game itself is because it's so narrative heavy and wraps up. I mean, it has enough open ended elements at the end to certainly warrant a straight up sequel. But I think my interests more lie in getting feedback on this initial idea of making an audio game, an all audio game, and deciding whether or not I'll have the opportunity to make a larger game with visuals that will carry all the things I learned about accessibility forward into that game. Making an accessible game that has visuals. I mean, the pipe dream of this is, I suppose, creating a game that could be, because my game's inaccessible to the deaf community,
Hmm.
because it's all audio, it's all only audio. There's no visuals. But making a game that would be accessible for everybody, that potentially somebody within the deaf community and the blind community could both play the game potentially together,
Hmm.
and with the idea too of again, I kind of walked backwards into the trope of having a blind protagonist. As much as I've enjoyed doing that, I would want that to be a feature potentially of character selection, that you
Hmm.
could play a game and play as a blind character, a deaf character, a sight, or whatever, and that would be a feature of the actual RPG experience, and it would potentially change the way the game plays.
Wow.
As sort of a meta idea, I think that'd be kind of interesting. I don't know if it'll become practical or interesting to anybody but me, but I don't know. That's kind of the thing I would love to try to do. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'm definitely gonna do more of this. I'm certainly going to try to work in accessibility in games that I think are uh, are can sort of make room for it in the other projects I'm working on. And narrative heavy games tend to make sense for this.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And thinking of games that could be both accessible to the blind and the deaf community, one approach is what you said, having it be at the very start an option that you choose. What are some of the other ways that you envision that sort of being possible or taking place in sort of game design, uh, in the game design of a game?
Yeah, I mean, there's a recent game, Last of Us 2, which is 100% accessible.
Yeah.
And what that would come down to is and similar to what we did, is you just have to look at all the different systems that make up a game, starting with the menus and those sorts of things, and find out ways to make them accessible. In terms of having audio feedback for every input. Another thing that we did, and is a big part of the development, is uh, I liked it because I'm okay with simplifying the experience, making choices matter more, um, but limiting them, so
Hmm.
that when I go into a store, or if I collect loot from an enemy, and this is like the RPG convention of massive amounts of loot, and I find myself like managing material, like things more than I end up playing what I think is the narrative core of the game. So I don't mind stripping that stuff away. So stripping it down to make it to less complex, but making sure there's choice and value and agency within the game. Those are the two big things. And
Hmm.
in approaching a bigger game, like a super narrative heavy game, like a Skyrim or a Witcher type scenario, I feel like there's probably ways and analogous versions of combat, analogous versions of adventuring, that would basically provide the same idea of the feeling that you want to evoke in terms of combat or exploration. And then the narrative is the part that's the common denominator between the different versions of the game. And that's, for those types of games, what's probably the core of it anyway. So if you can find a way to deliver that content, I think of how much narrative content, how much money goes in the narrative content for a game like Skyrim or Witcher, with music, voiceover, everything is voiced as well. This
Yeah.
is already there. It's a matter of how do you pull it together in a way that people feel is compelling. And I ask everyone to check out Last of Us 2, because I think they've done a really good job of that. And it's funny, I used to talk just about how big games like The Witcher should be doing so, like people should be doing versions of this, so they should have accessible versions of the game. But now that somebody's come and finally done this, and I think it's hopefully pointing the way forward. So anybody who has a lot of audio content, it would be great for them to find a way to deliver that, with learning from what other people are doing. Hopefully maybe something in my game will be a lesson.
Hmm.
I think if anything, I like that we've taken what could be looked at as a negative, which is a very simple inventory system or a simple shop experience,
Yeah.
and saying, well, what you don't get in the complexity of the choice, you get in the immersion of the choice. It's a conversation you're having, you're bartering and talking with a person, and you can close your eyes and you don't see the menu or the system. You see the person and him holding out things to offer you, and you buying them. It doesn't take you out of the first person immersion.
Hmm.
And that's something that convention sort of dictates in visual experiences that you're removed from. It goes to a menu system so you can manage all this stuff. So maybe there's something to learn from that. That maybe people are good with a little less choice if they can stay in the game more uh, in a more immersive way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do feel that sometimes branching narratives can sometimes result in a poorer narrative experience.
Yeah.
There's definitely a risk there.
And that's my, honestly, that when I started this project, part of it was that I wanted to experiment with that. And it was a cheap way to do that. Because, you know, if you want to add characters or scenarios or locations, it's a lot cheaper to do it in audio than it is in creating an entire space. And that's probably, if you're asking what I might want to develop, probably still within an accessible experience, is really playing with that, is trying to get really satisfying narrative experiences with as much agency and choice as possible. It might be a bit of a holy grail that may be really hard to do. I think a lot of teams struggle with that, and people have made a good attempts at doing it.
Hmm.
And really, you're looking to strike balance, I think, ultimately.
Yeah, yeah. And so in the Vale specifically as well, what were some of the things that you might have done differently had you known what you know now or have had the experience that you have now? Looking back, are there some things that you would approach in a different way, or certain things that you would have done in a different order, or yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think ultimately, I mean, there's all sorts of things that you're going to find in game development in general. There's nothing special about this in terms of realizing it. Maybe the nice thing about this experience was that I was so reliant on a group to help me focus test, because I was doing something so new, that it brought people in to think about the game earlier than maybe I would have. So sometimes you sit with a project on your own for a long time, you fall in love with certain ideas, and it's that much more painful to have to change them when you start showing it to people late in the game. So
Hmm.
because I started with the group, that was something that mitigated a lot of this. Maybe I don't have a very good story of what I would have done different, because I just included the groups of people so early in the process.
Hmm.
I mean, in hindsight, I would have done a lot of things a lot faster, but I eventually got there, I think.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe, I mean, there's, from a production standpoint, um, I mean, there's lessons that I should have known better about, but I would bring in a senior developer from the beginning, a programmer. I
Program. Yeah.
start seeing the value. I've been working with senior developers for a long time on other projects, and I probably spent a little bit too long in sort of my own prototyping world. And once I saw what value I get out of an experienced person, I'm like, oh my gosh, let's bring that, let's do this right this time from the beginning.
Hmm.
But even that, there's a lot of validity in doing really rough, terrible prototyping to get results quick and dirty. But I probably will do that with an experienced programmer next time. Yeah,
Hmm.
so I only have production related stories. I know what I want to do with the next game, but I still feel for the audience. I mean, this is why the answer isn't very clear. Is that the audience is so broad. The blind community is so diverse. If I'm looking at just making a game for this very broad community, I think I would end up on the game I have now. Maybe the bigger question is in evaluating what the potential success of the game is how I might change it. Then that's when I think I'll have a better idea, where I realized, wow, there's a lot of the hardcore gaming community is the group that really wanted more from the game, and the more casual gamer wasn't as interested in the game to begin with. There's some feedback like
Hmm.
that, where I'll realize what my next game will be. Well, it might be a more casual experience or less. I can see myself making a game for younger kids who have visual impairment, and it would become much broader and accessible. Or I find there's a hardcore group. I mean, they play this game called Swamp, and it's a
Uh-huh.
first person shooter in the dark, and it's terrifying, and it's impossible. It's so hard to play. So every time I send a build to people who play this game, it's never hard enough.
Yeah.
It's so hard. I can't play my own game, and they're like, oh, it's not hard enough yet. So maybe that's where I'm going. I don't know. We'll see.
Mm. Fantastic, fantastic. So before we wrap up, are there any other projects that you're working on at the moment?
I think mostly unannounced projects. I'm
Hmm.
excited about. I'm hoping at least one of them might eventually have an all audio version or an audio version. I'm excited about that. But they're narrative projects that are in the works, and they're probably a year away. So yeah, not even really close to talking about them.
Hmm.
And yeah, I'm just I'm just really anxious and excited to get to get this game out there.
Yeah.
And because there's people that when you have 3 or 4 games that come along a year, Mac tops, like for a community that's so content starved, it makes it even a little bit sadder when you can't get the game out quickly. So I really like to get this out for that community.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. What do you think some of the things are that could encourage more people to explore this kind of game um, on a wider basis?
Yeah, I do. Well, from a if it is about narrative and audio exclusively, so taking away the immersive aspect of it, I think there's something with the oh gosh, what are they, like Alexa and Google Home.
Hmm.
I feel like there's other things people, well, I should be looking at. Other people are, I'm sure they're already looking at this, but I think ultimately there are things, there's other sort of genre that are proving to me that there's people out here that want content like this. Just with the popularity of podcasts, some of them very narrative focused, and then I can see that there might be a world where you're making very narrative focused games, less game mechanic, fighting mechanic sort of based games. Um, so I feel like there's potential in all sorts of places for accessible content, and I ultimately I'd like to see anybody who has the means, or the content already there to really take a hard look at what their game is, because I think the best scenario is like what Naughty Dog has done, where they have a blind mode and not necessarily relying on people from other communities to port games that become accessible. And I just feel like that we're so close to having something, having conventionalizing, I guess, all audio experience, finding a common way of playing, of fighting, a common way of navigating, and having people set those expectations so that when certainly when the blind community comes to play these things, they know what to expect, and developers can look at what other developers have done with and have a certain amount of confidence of how expensive that's going to be and how effective it's going to be.
Hmm.
And I don't know how to encourage that other than I'm going to make my game,
Yeah.
and hopefully I will do it on my own.
Hmm.
And I mean, look, a big studio is already thinking about this, so I'm hoping that this is opening up, and this is going to be something that's just going to happen. That's my hope. Does Naughty Dog make another game from here on in that isn't accessible this way? It would be amazing if this isn't a one-off for them at the very least. So I don't know if I answered your question, by the
You
way,
know,
but
absolutely, absolutely. And I also think that it's, I mean, even for sighted players, it's just a very different and new experience. And it, yeah, for me, when I first played an audio game, I was kind of like, where has this been all my life? So,
yeah.
definitely, definitely cool stuff. And so before we wrap up, where can everyone sort of stay updated on the release of the Veil?
Yeah, we have a website at fallingsquirrel.com. We will post things there. But I mean, obviously for us, the best thing is when people wish listed on Steam. It's The Veil, Shadow of the Crown is the name of the game. I might put slightly more experimental demos or things on itch.io. I'm trying to use that as a place. Oh, by the way, itch is at this point in time, although I know someone, I believe Steam is trying to work on accessibility on their for their platform, because they're not as accessible. The community is well aware that Steam is not as accessible as itch.io at this point.
Hmm.
So looking for the game and supporting itch is probably great for the community as well. That's where the game is going to be there, and that's where I tend to do more of my sort of like, hey, try out this new mode sort of stuff, whereas the more official stuff sort of stays in the Steam area. So I would, whatever the mechanisms at itch or Steam are to follow the game, that would be great. And then the website would be the other place. And it is going to be on Xbox too. I shouldn't forget
Perfect.
about that, because that to me is more exciting because of
Hmm.
it's the idea of and again, because of Last of Us on Sony. That's where I think that's real proof that maybe advances are being made when things are showing up on consoles, with controllers and things that aren't as traditionally part of the audio game world.
Yeah. Yeah, and
So yeah, those are the places.
yeah, and they also have a lot more options like haptic feedback and stuff like that, I imagine, as well, in terms of making it more accessible.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah.
Mm. Well, Dave, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for being here today. It's been really interesting chatting about the game.
Yeah, no, thank you. I always like talking about my game.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button below for more audio content, and I will see you very soon.